インタラクティブに、もう話の途中でわからないことはスピークアウトで、質問してくださって構わないということです。それで、人数少ないんで、皆さん、30秒ずつですね、皆さんのご専門、ご所属をですね、ここでまず始める前に、日本語でも英語でも話してくださいということなんで、ぜひお願いしたいと思います。私は信州大学のカーボン科学研究所所属の黒岡と申します。特任教授を拝命しております。それでは、ドクター・アイリス・フェイトさんに、講演をしていただきたいと思います。Now,
yes.
And I told them introduce themselves.
Yes, they should definitely. I think because we're a small group, can you guys hear me or do I need a microphone? Can you hear me? I think because we're a small group, we should go around the room and each person say who they are. And if you have something in particular of interest that you want me to dwell on, because we're a small enough group, I have my slides, but I know how to speak impromptu. So let's do that. And Sushi, why don't you start?
もう一回、English ね。
As you like.
いらないでしょ。信州大、I'm from Kyushu University, Institute of Carbon Science and the Industry Research Center. And I have been involved with nanotoxicology, particularly carbon nanotubes. I used to belong to the Mitsui co-LTD, it's a Mitsui Bussan, and which distributed to Mitsui MWMT7 to all over the world for free, and no restriction to publish, disclose the toxicological test result. This is the first, probably historically, the first time, first company to allow such kind of very flexible the supply distributions. That's my.
And next.
そうです。たまたま鶴岡先生から、このレクチャーを、人がここでやるのでということでしたので、ご利用させております。I'm very a professor and chairman, very small, tiny group in a total of 5 people. And I'm background in pathologist too, and also I have a board of toxicology, pathology and toxicology. With this background, I have now currently 16 years doing about toxicology and toxicology, but this risk of nanomaterials, starting from metals, titanium dioxide, zinc, and now I'm shifting to the carbon nanotubes because carbon nanotubes is similar to asbestos, as you already know. So therefore, we're currently mostly focusing on the gas-based studies of nanomaterials, and we found already as Dr. Tsuruoka introduced that the MWC7, which was produced by Mitsui company, was shown to be carcinogenic by inhalation study. It took 5 years and vast amount of money. And we are now focusing on developing an easy, less expensive, simple method of detection of carcinogenic potential to carbon nanotubes. And we recently found, already published 2 years ago, that another type of carbon nanotubes, MWCMT10, it's a Nixo company provided us with for study. The found it also induces lung cancer and also led to illness in rats. So with this regard, we are now expanding our study for evaluation of carcinogenic potential for carbon nanotubes.
Wow. Well, there's a chapter in my book, chapter 2, is a discussion of the legal aspects of asbestos and in comparison with emerging nanotechnology. I'd love to get your comments on my book when it's published. It will be out in a few weeks.
Okay.
Sir, tell us who you are and your
まず
interests.
簡単にイントロダクション、日本語でも英語でもお願いします。
日本ゼオンの、中野と言います。ゼオンはですね、今リングボールカーナンテューブを製造している。
Oh, wow.
で、私は品質保証、製品安全の方を担当しています。
You might be interested in the hierarchy of controls when we get to it. I hope so. Fernando?
吹田連線、技術部の遠藤と申します。私自身もともと炭素材料に携わる仕事をしてまして、1年くらい前からナノカーボンの仕事を始めています。本日鶴岡先生の方に紹介いただいて、ご演説に来ました。
Dave? Lender of the USB stick.
Dave, lender of the USB stick. I work in Dr. Suda's lab, and so we're interested in nanotoxicology and concentrating on the toxicology of fibers, carbon nanotubes, and potassium octocyanate fibers, which is an asbestos substitute.
Okay, sure.
My name is Mamoru Yanaguchi from Shigematsu. Our interest is exposure control of nanomaterial by using protect respiratory apparatus, PPE. Yes. So we especially have the regulation how to in Japan. Thank you.
Thank you. Sure.
I'm Ahmed El Gassab from Alexandria University, Egypt, and I'm a member of Dr. Suda group, in the laboratory of Dr. Suda group, and my research focus comparison between cysts of double carbon nanotube and multiple carbon nanotube.
And you, sir?
So my name is Muhammad, PhD student in the lab. My work in titanium dioxide and multiple carbon nanotube.
Okay. And you're also from Egypt?
Yeah.
My friend Fatih Badawi is working in Kuwait, but he keeps his ties home very close. Very close. Sure?
My name is Isabel from the University Department of Pharmacology. I major theme is ion channel, especially calcium activated ion channel in the cardiovascular disease. So, but I also joined Dr. Tsuda's group as part of the experiment in vitro and in vivo experiments for safety and toxicology of the carbon nanotube.
And last but not least.
この大学の薬学部の大学院に所属してます新藤と申します。山村先生の下の学生で、三田先生の研究班にも属しています。カーボン研究を行っています。
So we should get some flyers from the Safer Nano program. We should do this. Okay. So, my working assumption, yes, my working assumption in my work, in all my work, has been science has taken this phrase revolution around nanotechnology, which is a very different meaning in the political and legal world. And I'm saying that if in fact it's a revolution for science, maybe it is a revolution in the legal and political world and a revolution for society. And if so, public health in particular should seize this opportunity to do some very new and creative things. That's my working assumption in all my work. My background is I taught at Columbia University School of Law, and then got a Master's of Science in Public Health from Johns Hopkins University, and ended up working in the UN for a while in public health, and then eventually got a doctorate, the first doctorate in the law of nanotechnology in the School of International Relations in Geneva. So for me, the focus is always around health and public health. And as I mentioned in the new book that's going to be out in a few weeks, the proofs are sitting in my machine and I have to approve them. There's an entire chapter on asbestos and whether it's really a blueprint for what's going to happen with nanotechnology, or from a legal standpoint, is there something we could do new and different to avoid the kind of catastrophic impact that asbestos had? Because asbestos poses this terrible dilemma that as horrible as it is, we also need it. And the asbestos industry is actually stronger today than it was in the times that we were discovering some of the problems. So the lesson there is that we have to really think carefully about dangerous materials and really have a good regulatory regime, because we will not arrive at a time where we don't have them at all. And so when I think about nanotechnology, I'm very pleased that all of you know something about it, a great deal, much more than me, because I spend a lot of time when I do this talk describing what is nanotechnology. But as you'll see in a moment, defining nanotechnology and knowing what nanotechnology is may be very different. This is a photograph from my hometown where I was raised in New York City. This is the internal workings of the General Assembly of the United Nations. And in the United Nations, this is a photograph of an extremely magic moment in time. And I asked the question, will this moment in time exist in nanotechnology? This is the moment when an idea becomes a law. Now, for the people that were abstract thinkers and futurists and thought experiments, this is the end. It's finished. There's a law now. There's no more debate. There's no more questions to raise. But for the people who worked to implement the law, this is the birth of their work. This is the starting point. This particular photograph is the vote that was taken to accept the Convention on Prevention of Discrimination Against People with Disabilities. For some people, it was a very long road. They could put it back to the early 2000s when people were lobbying for a convention. They could put it back into the 1990s when HIV/AIDS caused major changes in disability law around the world, some of which the World Health Organization has discussed in its definition of disability. And they could put it back to the early laws protecting veterans and people who had very visible disabilities in the early 20th century, if they wanted to try and trace when did it begin. And that would end right there at that picture. And then the next part of the picture, the next thing to do is to make the dreams and ideas that are embodied in that law into something real. And the question I ask you is, what's the future for nanotechnology from this point of view? Will this happen for nanotechnology? I personally think that even if it doesn't happen in the UN exactly, it's extremely likely to happen somewhere. And I will tell you some of the reasons. And I want you to debate me on my point of view about these reasons. So first of all, how big is nano? I mean, we all know that one hair, if you just pull the strand, you'll correct me if my math is wrong, the diameter of one hair is 100,000 nanometers. Is that about right? Okay, we all know that. And scientists love to tell me how tell me the scientific definition, Dave.
Of nano?
Yes.
Less than 100 nanometers.
On one or more dimensions, right? Well, now you have to think of it from a totally different perspective. You have to think of it as a legislator or a consumer or a worker who doesn't necessarily know what nanotechnology is. And they walk into a grocery store in Switzerland, and there's a toy called Nanomania, which is about this big. It would be illegal in the States because 3-year-olds could swallow it, okay? But it's a toy. And it's given out in the store if you buy a certain amount of food, and it's traded on the web like a commodity. People are crazy for this toy. Does that consumer really know that that's not really nano, the way you described?
Well, nano can also mean small.
Exactly, it's Greek for dwarf. So now if we're talking about a nanotechnology and nano-enabled products, and we're talking from the perspective of the general public, maybe our definition isn't always useful. Maybe our definition is going to get us into some trouble. So the grocery store had nano. There's actually a car called nano. There's a whole bunch of products out there. And the question that this raises when you start trying to regulate just to protect public health for a very good and noble cause, and one that I support with all my being, the minute you talk about nanotechnology and nano things, suddenly the choice of definitions is going to become very complex because it's not just what scientists think it is. And if it is just what scientists think it is, aren't some people going to try and game that? Just make that 101 or 102 nanometers. Tell me the truth. Isn't that possible? To get out of the regime. Or just make it just so that, well, it's a cluster, so it's not really 100, so it's really big and we really can't fit that rule anymore, right? So how the public thinks about nano, and how does this common perception alter society's view of nano risk? This sounded really abstract when I started studying it in 2011. But as we get closer and closer to that regulation picture that I'm showing you, a moment in time when the idea that we should do something to protect people about nano exposures, as that gets closer and closer to becoming a real law, this is really a problem area. So the really big question, of course, how big is nano? The easy answer is this: $3 trillion in 2015. That's the easy answer. And that's a very important answer because it means that lots of people who don't care about science and don't understand science are going to care about nano when they hear that phrase nano at the beginning. You want to say something? For legislative drafting, this is very important. Some people are going to use nano as a way to attract consumers and wouldn't necessarily fit in that rubric that we all in this room think we know of as nano. Nano everybody knows. And some people are going to avoid the nano label even though they're working in that purely scientific arena and doing things that are extremely important. And legislatures have to worry about this. Whether they're in the UN or in the municipality of Cambridge, Massachusetts, they all worry about this. And they face this problem. Which products are nano or not? And just to give you an example, this is a very old slide. This is the slide that got me started. This slide was given to me in 2008 in Geneva, Switzerland, when Dr. John Howard, who's the head of the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health in the United States, came to Geneva just to teach us about nanotechnology. And he gave a lecture. It was a beautiful lecture. It took an hour and a half. Nobody left the room. Everybody was mesmerized. And he gave me his slides afterwards. And he presented this very slide, which he gave me as a gift. This is 2008, what was already on the market with nanomaterials. This is extraordinarily important, not only because so many of these things are obsolete, which means you could never capture data about them if you had to retrospectively do some epidemiology on these folks, but also the presence of nano was already very great. We're talking a decade ago. And John said to me, Ilise, I'm sorry. I gave you this slide and it's outdated. It only reflects a small percentage of the products with nano-enabled materials in 2008. And that's why I keep this slide, because this slide looks really big to me. You've got cars and cameras and pharmaceuticals and food storage and just about every clothing, which was already litigated in the United States, the use of nano silver on clothing. Okay, it looks pretty encompassing, and it's 10 years ago, and it was only a small fraction. So this raises very, very important questions when we think about that definition of what we mean by nano, when we want to protect health. And then added just to this because society is complex today. We have nanomedicine. Are we going to make a separate regime for nanomedicine? Or are we going to use some of that definitional base, some of that time spent educating the general public about nanotechnology to actually have them mentioned in the same body of law? That's a political judgment. I'm not here to say which way you go. I can offer routes of how you would go if you wish to do that. But in fact, these are magical things that people are going to want. Some of them are going to want them without question because right now, a lot of the nanotechnology enabled medicines touch end-of-life folks who are not even necessarily going to live a long time to complain if something goes wrong, but don't expect a whole lot of really big results. They expect a few weeks or months or quality of life a little better at the end. So we're not even going to really be able to show whether it was good or bad for a very long time. But it's going to be a very, very important source of social change in the future. And that, therefore, we have to think about, is that part of this regime when we talk about regulating nano and making things safe? So the first thing that I want, if you have one message from me, is that we need forethought. Forethought beats afterthought. We need clear and thoughtful rules. I'll give you my reasons why I think the rules are going to happen, whether we want them or not. And my message is, be part of that process. Think clearly about what you want the law to look like and how it should be, and participate in that process. You guys know better than I do. Nanotechnology is going to change industry. It's going to change health. I believe it's going to change the meaning of health and disability in society. And I have written entire chapters on that in the book, because not only are we going to change the methods, we're going to change defining who is sick or well in order to get treatment. And do they get insurance for that? And do they get protection against discrimination based on disability? Or are we just going to tell them that they're sick in a way other people aren't? These are legislative questions. And these are questions that are not covered by existing law. So to define the issue is very, very difficult. The easy part is for scientific definition, scientific inquiry. Does the nature of engineered nanostructured materials and devices present new safety and health risks? Putting aside all that natural, volcanic nano, that the public doesn't know the difference between that and the engineered product. The real question is, how can the benefits of nanotechnology be realized while proactively minimizing that potential risk? And the reason this question is so brilliant, it's not mine, it's John Howard, and he's one of the finest minds of this century. The reason this is so brilliant is it embraces, if you wish, the natural and the accidental nanoparticles just as much as the nano that we engineer deliberately, all of which may interact in some ways we don't understand. And it really isn't a cost-benefit analysis. It's a question of minimizing potential risk. At its bottom, it recognizes the presence of nanotechnology in society, and this is a regulatory question. It recognizes the essential need to have some method of regulating. So why would we want to care about regulating just in the abstract, the way I've been complaining for 10 years? Well, just to give you an example, in the same 2008 that John was talking, already the Swiss Department of Public Health had put forth a very complicated precautionary matrix. Interesting document, written in English, although their languages are 3 other languages. It is not a law, it is a guideline. It is a complex matrix with a variety of variables that an employer or manufacturer plugs in the variables. It is not discoverable by a government agency because it's a guideline. And it's pretty realistically good even today as an attempt to try and harness all this data. Because the Swiss National Science Foundation was ambivalent. They looked at nanotechnology and they said It's great stuff and exciting promises, and certainly Swiss Pharma stands to make a lot of money on it, so there's no question of a clear national interest in nanotechnology. But the Swiss government said these behaviors also have the potential consequences on the abilities to cause harm in novel ways.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
What's the definition of the law and the guideline? What's the difference between the law and guideline?
Oh, that's a lovely question. That is a volume of legal work. What is the difference between law and guideline? A guideline has no meaning under law. That's the difference. A law is a king, a legislature, an executive branch, a department head, a Congress, a parliament comes forward and says, this is how we want it done. A guideline is a lot of people get together and they think this is a good idea. Now, of course, in the real world, some guidelines are more important than some laws. If you go to a country with very weak laws and you have an ISO standard, which is not a law because it does not come from a legitimate elected government authority, okay, then in those contexts, if you want to write a contract and you want to sign off on ISO standards, there you could argue the guideline is more powerful. But what makes it more powerful is it's been incorporated into a contract, which is an act of law between two people. Okay? So a law can be changed, but must be obeyed pretty much. Whereas a guideline, it's just a nice idea. It's just something we think we want to do. And although some guidelines are more powerful than some laws, if you go to a judge in a court, just about anywhere in the world, and you show up and say, this is the law, the judge is going to read that law and try to make the decision that will be consistent with that law. And if you go and you say, this is the guideline, then they'll say, prove who wrote it, why did they write it, what was their interest, how do we know they knew what they were talking about, why should this court care about this when we have other laws? Because that's the guideline. And it is an extremely complex area because so many people in nanotechnology come from so many areas and there are so many unknown questions, as all the governments have noted, that in fact lots of people are writing guidelines. Will those guidelines matter is a very, very difficult question. It's a very difficult question. But what it does do when you have a guideline is it gives you a starting point. If you don't obey the guideline, you better have a reason, just like a law. But if you go to a court, the fact that you have a guideline may help you if nobody has a law, but won't help you if there is a law. It's very complicated. Thank you for your question.
Because particularly we are Japanese, and looking at the European guidelines, it's a guideline. It's sort of the regulation. We have to follow the guideline, otherwise we can explore.
A guideline is not a regulation.
But without the tick sheet under the guideline, we can export the products to Europe, particularly nanotechnology.
Right.
Will be like that in the near future.
But the problem is, it's because of the fact that the photograph I showed you at the beginning doesn't exist yet. Right now, we're in the process of an evolution towards a law of nanotechnology somewhere. And I think the old question, do we need a law, is finished. So many people started writing guidelines and laws that you're not going to make the argument none is needed. The question will be which one. And in the interim, a guideline is very handy. It's very useful because you don't have a law and you do have a problem. So you put the guideline in the middle because the people making those decisions don't have the legislative authority. They don't have political power. They weren't elected or appointed by a Congress to actually do something. They are smart and they know something. But because it's a guideline, it is much, much easier to challenge it and to say, who are these people and why should we care about what they say? It's true, you want to ship to Europe, you take off the guideline. But you could challenge it if you said, for example, we in Japan have a requirement under law that says such and such. What do we do about your guideline? And then they would have to respond. But since you don't have a law, you have a guideline. It fills the void. Will it help you down the road is a very difficult legal question. It helps you today, no question. So,
one question.
Yes.
How do you think about the IR classification of carcinogenicity? For example, carbon nanotube M77 was rated group to B. Sufficient evidence in animals. Thus, possibly carcinogenic to humans. Is that a guideline or just a material for the regulatory purposes?
It's not either. That's the problem. IARC, of course, is part of an international governance.
Right.
And therefore, what they do has a treaty component to it, that it can become international law. But the problem is it's out of context. It's a list you can refer to. It's a definition that's very wise to use, but it still doesn't have the big framework around it. As you'll see, the emerging problem in nanotechnology is going to be context. The emerging problem is not going to be that it's really dangerous, because we do dangerous stuff all the time. I mean, we had people crash in luge in Olympics, and you can argue they knew what they were doing and blah, blah, blah. At the end of the day, it was dangerous. So, and you can't argue whether you could or should stop them. The fact is, at the end of the day, it was dangerous. We do dangerous stuff all the time. The question is the context, and this, the IARC doesn't really have the capacity to pass the judgment.
Right. Because it's not a risk assessment, but it's a hazard identification, not a risk. Therefore, I think IARC's task is just to provide materials for the regular purpose for each country.
Yes, and then you see again, this to my idea that we need to think about a global something. Because IARC does wonderful work, but it doesn't have the framework and the context.
Right.
Somebody's going to come along and not follow IARC, and then you have to show why they're good or bad. As I say, if you have 150 countries that do the same thing, and the King of Morocco says, not in my country, suddenly you've got two bodies of law. And once you have a choice of law, you have a conflict of laws, you have a debate among the lawyers which law applies, you have to prove to the other one the law that you want to use exists, and it becomes very expensive. And when it's expensive, it will impede commerce. So the trick right now, in this magic time, when we don't yet have that photograph at the beginning, is to be involved to try and make the best possible photograph when the time comes. And IARC is very problematic because they do excellent work. And they're used out of context, and they're used inappropriately, and they're ignored by people who should listen. And this is a very real problem. Am I making sense to you?
Yeah. In Japan, in our country, I'm a member of the risk assessment committee by the government, and compound which are rated as group 2B is considered to forward to the regulatory purpose. So I think this is one of the way to mark the compound for the risk assessment and send to the regulatory purpose.
Sure.
Just material.
Sure. You realize that's an interpretation, that's not a rule. So you're making perfect sense and you have good science behind you. Will somebody else do it is a very difficult question. Yes, exactly. So just to give you an example, I had flashed through the NIOSH had decided to create a recommended exposure level for carbon nanotubes and nanofibers. I had participated in the comments on that recommended exposure because actually NIOSH doesn't have the power to write rules. That's done by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. In the U.S. Department of Labor, under the Occupational Safety and Health Act, which also founded NIOSH. And there was a great deal of discussion. Why is NIOSH doing this? And the reason NIOSH is doing this is this magic phrase in the Occupational Safety and Health Act. Each employer shall furnish to each of his employees employment and a place of employment which are free from recognized hazards. And at first, the first 20 or 30 years of OSH Act, there was a lot of debate. What is a recognized hazard? We arrived at a point where the courts and the judges pretty much say, if NIOSH says it's a recognized hazard, it's a recognized hazard. And subsequently, NIOSH has taken an international leadership role in a lot of places, sending people to capacity building and such. So the fact that it was a recognized hazard in the eyes of NIOSH could give justification for a recommended exposure limit, but they can't create a law and standard because why? Because the statute said they can't. They said somebody else does it. You know, you work in a university and you're not going to drive a train tomorrow. And that it's just that way. So they needed a justification for getting in there and saying, hey, we recognize this hazard. We don't have the power to pass a law about it, but we do have the power to say what we think that means. And in this same context, the Royal Commission in the UK had talked about the fact that there were all these possible nightmare scenarios. They talked about the mid-20th century when people tried to use the best new science to do really good things and had thalidomide babies and asbestos exposures and really, really horrible things that happened. And they said, you can't have a moratorium and stop nanotechnology, but at the same time, you have to think very, very carefully. And they were, by the way, criticized because they did not propose a new law in 2008. They said there might be some laws that can be modified that exist already, and there might be some areas that don't need new law, and there might be some new law that will emerge. And they were very wise to do that because there was not enough information at the time in order to really make a decision what should go into a law. This definition that I started to show you, that scientists know what nanotechnology is, and that may or may not apply to a car, which certainly can't be characterized as low risk. Cars are potentially a lethal weapon. And a car may be full of nano products, paint and tires and coatings on glass, and therefore some percentage of it might amount to meeting some nano standard somewhere written by some legislature. So if you were to define it by the percentage of a product that used nano-enabled materials, suddenly your car might actually be in the definitional box. So this is the dilemma. And what's really unique about this dilemma, and here Japan is a member of the OECD. The OECD has been working on this since 2007. What's really unique is it's a very strange moment in time. All of the governments that issued reports in the time between 2006 to about last year have consistently said that the risks are unknown and they don't know what to do. That's very unusual. Governments are famous for standing there and saying, this is the law, this is what we want, and this is how you're going to do it. That's what governments do best. Whether we like their laws and whether we got, if we all pay our taxes more or less, very few people send a bigger check, which is a very important concept of compliance. You obey the law to the point you're required. Very few people send a bigger check. Some people try to cheat at the edges and send a lower check. But in fact, ultimately, most people, most of the time, do send their checks. Okay? So why? Because the government says, this is the tax, this is how you're going to pay it, this is when it's due. And the government pretty much tells you how much you owe. You make a calculation, but if they don't like it, you have a tough time convincing them that you're right and they're wrong. That's law. And all these governments, one after another, are standing there saying, we don't know what to do. That's a very unusual moment in history. And yet we think we're talking about universal rights. What I mean by this is a photograph of the Swiss delegation in the UN in Geneva debating on a working committee. This is like real people sit and read reports and do things. We're talking about, when we talk about universal rights, we're talking about a legal principle that means that the same problem comes up over time, different civilizations, different geography, different places, and yet that same problem shows up. And the problem that we're seeing here is a question of, first of all, how are we going to define nano? Are we going to go out of our way to make a very narrow scientific definition, which I personally think can be gained if somebody wants to be unprotected by the regulation, but also will be slightly deceptive to the public because people who will use the nano words won't be protected under a regulatory framework. And then the public will have a false sense of confidence that there's some test or some authority you could complain to if things go wrong. But how are we going to define it? These are universal problems for every place I've lectured. What is nanotechnology? Now I'm saying under law. I'm not saying in your personal definition, which could play a role if you speak to your legislature. But what is it that we actually want the legislature, whoever it is, whether it's our local government or our national government in Japan or the regional government in the EU or the United Nations itself or some other bunch of other nations like OECD, what is it we really want them to worry about? What is it they ought to be protecting? And what is a nanoparticle sounds really simple if you use a scientific definition. But if you talk about whether it's engineered or manufactured, whether it's accidentally given off in some chain reaction of some other stuff, or naturally occurring like the volcano, suddenly you don't know what a nanoparticle is from the point of view of how you're governing society and protecting against risk. Suddenly it's a very complex question. And these have ethical implications. They have questions of, do we have some community standard? That's where your guidelines come in. Community standards of care in the absence of a real law. Something that fills the void, that people in this room do know what it answers to these questions from a scientific standpoint, and could, if they had to, go to a court of law and say, we in our group, we all agree this is what this is. And this is very difficult questions. So one of the big questions that is sort of lurking here that doesn't get discussed much, but that we have to think about when we have forethought about where law should be and what it should do, is this strict liability? Or is it only from nanomaterials? Or is there some kind of immunity? Strict liability. You use nanotechnology, you're responsible for the following consequences. And by the way, if the consequences aren't listed, you're not responsible. If you can come up with a bad thing that's a consequence that's not on the list, you may have no liability because the list is the strict liability, right? Do we want to prevent harm to human health, or do we want to look at other questions, the environment, certain species that are particularly at risk, certain populations within humanity that are more at risk than others, the impact on the global burden of disease? These are legislative questions. And the answers to these questions are policy judgments. There is no right or wrong answer yet because we have no law. And just to show you the other things that have to go into this package, and it's a package that's beginning to emerge, as you will see, is when you talk about worker health and workplace exposure, which WHO made a pronouncement in December on what is worker health and what exposure should look like in the workplace. Well, is worker health something that's consistent with or competing with an environmental protection standard? Lots of countries have them in different parts of the government. So we know that different administrators are going to fight with each other for budget and territory and the right to regulate. But is there some theory that would bring them together? Or is it going to be that they're perpetually different? These are legislative questions. There are no right answers. And what's the proper role of government here? I have seen nanotechnology efforts at legislation on every one of the levels in this chart. And we know that on the one hand, we want to promote and protect R&D, and then seemingly opposite, although I believe they can be harmonized, we see calls for consumer health and environmental protection. What's fascinating is we see a lot of regional activity. By regional, I mean a cluster of countries working together in a region, in Europe, in the ASEAN group in Asia. And of course, the really big question is how? How are we going to do this? Does society strike the balance? Do we limit liability? Do we do some kind of immunity? Do we say, no, you use nano, you're completely liable? These are legislative judgments. These are things that people can actually write into the text of a law. And who are the stakeholders? I like to believe that in the case of nanotechnology, one of the really nice, universal, and unusual things about it is the stakeholders are everybody. Even if Coca-Cola builds a new Coca-Cola bottle, they're using nanotechnology, that they may not have either produced the nanotechnology or even produced the bottle itself. And therefore, they're a consumer as much as a stakeholder, as much as a seller of an end product. And although you might think that sounds really strange, if you go to a legislature and you want to represent stakeholders for consumer better interest, to have a particular protection of consumers, it would be nice to be able to have Coca-Cola on your side on that one instead of the other side of the table. And it's actually possible. It actually might happen. Because all of civil society is consumers. And as we know, when you look at tort liability, every step of the chain has a piece of liability. So who needs law? I mean, Ilise, you're talking all this complicated stuff. You've been talking almost an hour, and all you've got is questions. Who needs law? Well, I'm going to show you some of the people who think they need law, who have started to regulate in this area, towards that photograph in the beginning, towards that notion of that magic moment when a bunch of ideas start becoming really concrete with jobs in order to enforce and implement and make sure time frames and rules are followed. Okay? So first of all, the EU has at least a dozen programs. But the one that I really like is NanoReg. We're now in NanoReg 2. The sunset of NanoReg after 5 years was to release to the general public templates on specific substances, on what type of risk is expected for certain nanomaterials. They're templates, which means that I guess they're not really law, they're still a form of guidance. But you could argue that they're law to the extent that they are generated by the EU under a mandate from the EU. But the reason you would argue they're guidelines is they specifically say that you can change these templates sort of the way the Swiss matrix says, fit it to your needs so that you have some understanding of what's going on. Because it's much more important to take a candid picture than a Photoshop picture of what's going on in nanotechnology right now. We still don't have a lot of baseline data that we really need. So in the US, there's at least 100 agencies that I know about that have some type of jurisdiction over nanotechnology and nanoproducts. You may have noticed I've left out totally intellectual property, which is a huge area of litigation and legislation. But just the new TSCA 2016 has been rewritten with a view to nanotechnology. Not a very clear view, I must add, but some discussion of pre-registration of materials. The FDA, the Food and Drug, has been fighting about nano. They have a guideline. Now, here's an interesting use of guideline. They're a federal agency. They have a legislative mandate to write regulations with the power of law. And they wrote a guideline. And they said, this is a guideline. Don't make us say that it's law. They said, it's just a guideline. If it doesn't work, you have to come back to us. I'm not sure they have the power to write a guideline. But they said they wrote a guideline. NIOSH, of course, I explained to you, you have a recommended exposure limit from a non-authorized but fully funded and legitimate federal agency with authority vested in it by a real government. OSHA, on the other hand, very slow to do anything about nanotechnology, but has the beginnings of some discussion of what enforcement and inspection would look like in workplaces with nanomaterials. Very interesting to see that even though there may not be specific language because of those recognized hazard things I showed you in the beginning, but nonetheless, when an inspection comes and there's a problem, it will still be under the law. Very interesting. How are they going to solve that disconnect? And a good justification for the RELs, but not a very good recommendation for OSHA as a regulatory agency. They're willing to sort of leave it vague, but come in and inspect all the same. And this is just an old short list, also outdated, of the places that have been doing regulation. WHO, I'm very pleased to say, has just a few months ago, but in time for the proofs of my book, published its guidelines on protecting workers from potential risks of manufactured nanomaterials. I had actually commented on the original draft, and I am very pleased to see that a lot of things I was complaining about were fixed. There wasn't a lot of attention to low and middle income countries. There was no attention to women's needs as a specific rubric, but they did in the final committee include a lot of women and cite a lot of literature by women, a good step forward. And there was an elimination of the very convoluted discussion of risk mitigation had happened in the original guidelines in exchange for a very solid discussion rooted in what could only be called WHO law. And where did they get their authority? What are the methods WHO uses? When you had to use a different method from what WHO does, how did they do that and why? What is so unusual about nanomaterials? And of course, the nice part is that although they didn't make a lot of recommendations, at the end of the day, they were very strong on the importance of the hierarchy of controls, which I think you guys know better than I do, but I'll get to them at the end of my talk. How much time do I have?
10 minutes.
10 minutes. Okay. So this is, I live in France most of the time.
Yes, it's the no limit.
No limit. Thank you.
This already resolved at the problem.
4. No, I don't want to bore them. So 4, my God. Okay, that's wonderful. So, where I live in France, well then, do you have some questions for a second? I'm going pretty
Well,
fast.
I have a comment.
Sure.
It's about, well, so my personal interaction with OSHA happened a long time ago when I was a student. And we used radiation for measuring small amounts of everything.
And how did they get jurisdiction for radiation?
Well, what the, I guess, guideline was a lot, as low as reasonably achievable. There's radiation everywhere.
Yes, but it's governed by the NRC. It's not governed by OSHA.
Oh, I thought it was OSHA. Well, anyway, so
It's
I did. Well, I was a student.
Tell your sister-in-law you thought she's your wife.
No.
Okay.
But that's how they regulate it. So you have radiation, like.
Well, there's an alara for radiation,
Yeah.
yes.
So we had to have a coffee 1 meter away from where the radiation experiment was going on.
You should have had badges.
We did have badges.
And it told you how much radiation you were getting.
Well, we never.
And you just took the badge and put it next to the coffee.
No, we would turn them in. We had our badges and our finger rings and all that kind of stuff. But there was no like concrete. The first concrete thing when I came to Japan, I was flabbergasted. They had concrete laws about where radiation is going to be. You have to go to this room and you have to do these things and change your shoes and do all this stuff, as opposed to just having as low as reasonably achievable.
But you had a very sloppy employer because they even told you.
University of California, Berkeley.
So Cal OSHA should have been.
Maybe Cal OSHA. That's ringing a bell.
Sir.
Yeah.
You were in the wrong agency.
Oh.
That's why you got bad data. And your employer must have made sure that you didn't get the information of the right agency. I wouldn't go so far as to say they deliberately sent you to the wrong agency, but they sent you to the garage when you needed to buy a dress. They sent you to the wrong agency. NRC is some of the oldest law. Originally, it was the Atomic Energy Commission, and in the 1950s. And then in the 1960s, it was made into the National Radiation, I don't know. It's National Radiation Council Commission, something like that. They have regulations because I happen to have studied these regulations. Since we have time, I am always concerned about reproductive health in the workplace. And the really difficult question, which we will face in nanotechnology, and I did write about in my book, of whether you need a separate body of regulation for women, or we don't call them unborn in the United States because they have no rights, but certainly during the time of gestation. And that's very politically misused in America. It gets thrown into abortion, and then they look at whether you pay women the same as men during pregnancy as for paternity leave, and they forget to look at the actual exposures and the actual working conditions. The law in the United States in particular lets you have a lot of exposure in a dirty place because you're guaranteed the job, you can't be thrown out, and then it's silent and goes no further and does not look at any real scientific impacts that might impact health down the road, either of mother or child. Okay? And so because of that, these same questions are going to be revisited with nano, without a doubt. Because we have, what's unique in that situation, nano, we have transplacental therapies and drugs. So we know the transplacental superhighway goes one way. Logic tells you it's going to go two ways. And we know from HIV that we have children born with HIV from moms with HIV and children born without HIV from moms with HIV, and we don't know why. So we know that there's something magic that happens in there, and we have never chosen as a society to really focus on it. And nano's going to make this really important because we're going to deliberately introduce nano in transplacental therapies, which means now we have an obligation to know what comes back. And so this is a very important area. And guess what? NRC actually has regs. They have a concept of what's called a declared pregnancy. They have a certain listing of duties that are excluded and allowed under NRC in the radioactive context. It doesn't apply in other areas because that's the quirk of U.S. law. But in fact, they have a multi-tiered approach that does not exist in other laws. So I happen to know what goes on there. And I find it very strange that they sent you to OSHA instead of the people.
Well, they didn't send it. I mean, that's just, the regulations that came down to.
And ALARA is not a reg, it's a guideline.
Right. So, but that's how they handled all this dangerous stuff.
Well, somebody should have.
I mean, people, you throw the radiation in the trash. And I remember
and you knew that wasn't a good idea.
Well, there was an alarm that when the trash guy went out, the radiation alarm went off. But anyway, so it's kind of.
Okay, so we don't want to bore everybody with the United States and our nostalgia, but the point is that what you've given a really good example of how people get bad information. Mm-hmm. Because at the very time you're talking about, since this regulation started in the 1950s, you might not yet have been working in the 50s.
No, not
okay.
Yet.
So there was already an answer to your question under law. And what's really curious is that information did not get out to you when you were needing it. And that might sound great for the employer in the short term. They got away with it. They didn't get inspected and fined. But if there had been some kind of long-term, like if you had a child with a disability that could be linked to that, they would have gotten hit with a really nice liability because you would have been able to come to court and say, oh, OSHA didn't come in. And the first thing they would have said is, what OSHA? And you would have offered evidence that you didn't know there was anybody else to go to. And since you didn't know there was anybody else to go to, you weren't protected properly, and that in itself was a violation of law. So you see, try and bring it back to nano, because I think the reason I think what you're saying is useful is these things are going to play out again in nano. Mm-hmm. The difference is we have the opportunity now, because we know these scenarios exist. We have the opportunity to actually say, this is what we want the law to do when that happens. This is what we want the law to do to stop that from happening. We can do that. But you were misinformed if you thought OSHA was involved and there were only guidelines.
Well, I mean.
No, that's not well. I mean. So in the EU, for example, just to bring it back to nano, so you have NanoReg, you have Marina, you have NanoSafe. We are funded through the Safer Nano for the program that we're teaching in France together in May. These are all, you can't call them federal because the EU is a regional organization, but the EU has 27 countries. And when the countries signed off on the treaty and gave their money for those programs, those are law. And those laws come from here, this really intimidating building. I've been there. It's in Brussels. This is the European Parliament. There's a real legislature in Europe that speaks for Europe. And you're nodding your head, you know it's a very powerful voice. But the interesting thing is it's not the only voice of Europe. Europe speaks with one voice twice. And an interesting legal issue comes out of that. There's also the Council of Europe, which is 47 countries, not 27, including Switzerland fully, not as a visitor who flutters in and chooses which program they want to participate in and which they want to fund. For example, Swiss gets about 3 times more money for science than it contributes because of the high quality of its very fine scientific programming. But it chooses not to participate in a bunch of other programs, and the treaty says Swiss gets to choose. That's the status that they wrote for them. They don't have the same money as the rest of Europe. They have the Swiss franc. They don't participate in the financial side. And that's their status. That was their condition as a sovereign. It was their right to say, if you don't do it this way, I won't join. And enough people wanted Swiss to join that they wrote a special rule just for Swiss, and they pick and choose when they participate. But in the Council of Europe, they're a founding nation. And this treaty was written in the 1950s after World War II in response to the really horrible genocides that were occurring in World War II for a variety of races. And the interesting thing about the Council of Europe is it has a council of ministers. It has a parliamentary assembly that's elected in each of the countries involved. It has 850 million constituents. Let me say that again. 850 million constituents. It has a Congress. It has authority for non-governmental organizations to be credentialed and actually participate in the deliberations. They're not lobbyists. They have a treaty-based right. Guidelines. There are guidelines in many countries of who can become a lobbyist and how do you register, and the law may say what they can or cannot do as a lobbyist, but they have no statutory right to participate in the legislative process.
I don't know.
Where did I lose you? Where did I lose you? Guidelines. Allow people.
Like he said, the guidelines and laws and regulations
are different.
The hierarchy of in general, hierarchy of the top of them should be the law, because the law usually includes the penalty. Right? The guideline doesn't have the penalty.
Not true. They're parallel universes. The law comes from elected officials, legitimate legislative authority. That's why ISO doesn't count. Okay? The law comes from legislative authority of legitimate officials. Once in a while you get a fight about are they the legitimate government. That does happen. But as a general matter, the law is from legislative authority. Legislative authority, the legal term is delegates, gives power to an agency who regulates. Because the legislature doesn't have time all day to do all the regulation. So they take their power and they give it to somebody else, and they say, you regulate. That's why when I talked about OSHA, the OSH Act said, we don't like the way the Department of Labor does research. We're going to give this power over here to NIOSH in health, and we're going to give this power over here, enforcement and inspection in labor. But the power comes from the law, and the law comes from elected officials. Guidelines come from anybody. The only reason guidelines enter the story is these guys aren't doing their job. And they don't know what they're saying, and they're mixed up, and somebody comes along and says, I know what to do. It just happens nobody elected me. So I have an idea, or my group has an idea, and I'm going to do this, and we think this is what's best. And until you guys tell us to do something else, a lot of people are going to do what we do. And that's why ISO and guidelines from WHO and places like that. That's why those things are important. The WHO guidelines are a trick because, like NIOSH, WHO does not have legislative authority. It has authority from other things that go through the General Assembly that they hold every year, the World Health Assembly. And the guidelines never went to that assembly and were never subject of legislative discussion. So they took their power that they're famous in WHO and they put together a group of people and they made a statement. But it actually has no legal authority. To have legal authority, it has to have that legislature, okay? But what's curious about the Council of Europe that I find fascinating, why I did write for them about nanotechnology, and I was fascinated by this. They have a statutory authority for NGOs. You have the group of the Japanese Nanotoxicology Scientists Association, and you can petition for the right, not just to lobby, but to actually participate in the process and to be somebody that they come to for information as an obligation of whatever else is going on. That is a small, big difference. Okay? Anybody can form any organization and sign up and go to the US Congress and in Japan, the Parliament, anywhere you want, and as a group ask for something, maybe they'll listen to you and maybe not. And if they do listen to you, there are rules they have to follow about listening to third parties. They can't take too many bribes. They can't not declare it. No, but this is okay. Okay? You can't just write a check and say, I want this law, see you tomorrow, although some people try. But in the Council of Europe, you actually can have a status that gives you the right to participate in everything else that goes on. That's really unusual. And you don't have to be from Europe for it. And of course, the legal question, you guys know math better than I do. If you've got 27 countries in the EU and 47 in the Council of Europe, somebody isn't European under the EU definition and is in the Council of Europe. It's about half the countries in the Council of Europe. So if you want to have a Council of Europe-wide or European, or they call it pan-European rule, who are you covering? You want to get one of these guys into the rule because they disobeyed it, or one of these guys wants to get somebody to obey a rule that helps them? Does it count? It sounds really silly to us, but in fact, this is huge. You're making a nanotechnology rule. And you got two parallel in the same region with the same name, Europe, but in fact, a few million people, like a couple 100 million people, aren't exactly in both definitions. But the really magic thing about the Council of Europe is the European Court of Human Rights. Even though we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, any of you guys ever heard of that? No. It's a guideline. It's not law, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They knew they could never get the countries to agree to it. But the European Charter in the 1950s is the European Charter of Human Rights. And there is a court. And individuals can go against their government and have gone against their government and won in the European Court of Human Rights. It's a mind-boggling concept to a lot of countries. You could actually go to another governance and complain about your own country and get relief from somebody else.
So the it's always Professor Suda talking about animal rights is also guideline or law.
Who wrote it?
For Europe, you cannot conduct the animal test.
Oh, but that's because of it. That's because of the treaty. That's not. So treaty is law.
Yeah.
Treaty is made by elected officials.
Yeah, but
If it's in a treaty, it's not a guideline.
But the country will not join the treaty, free from that guideline.
Oh, that's a very complicated question of international law. I would so love for you to have me talk about that. Because the question is how many people have to sign off for it to become law.
Right.
And that is an ancient, universal question of law.
Right.
okay? And you could see how having two European organizations just plays right into that. And you get one of them to say it's okay, doesn't mean, unless you get the Council of Europe. I mean, if you just go to the EU, there are these other countries that are European. They think they're European, and the Council of Europe thinks they're European, but the EU doesn't. And the underlying issue, and with Brexit, this is going to become more important, because very few people dispute that British people are European in some national sense, although they're not going to belong to the EU anymore. They will continue their membership in the Council of Europe. So what that means is you could be European and not the EU in a much more pronounced way than it was before. So yes, a treaty, it could be part of the treaty. How many people have to sign the treaty for them to bind everybody else is a very complex question of international law. At the UN, we deal with that all the time because they write treaties all day long. And then there's another process. There's the first thing is you get agreement on the text of the treaty, and then you get what they call signatory states. You need a certain amount of them. Once you have enough signatory states, then you need something called ratification. Without the signatory states, you don't ask for ratification. Ratification means I take the treaty in my pocket, I go home, and I say to my legislature, sign this. Okay? And how many of those ratifications do you need before you have international law, whether you signed or not? This is very complicated because countries are sovereign. And very few people can tell a country what to do. My government can say, Ilise, you have to do this. And I say, okay, I'm sorry. But you're telling that to Russia, for example, when they violate something in the Council of Europe and they didn't sign. This is not easy. So it's a very, very complicated area. I would love for you to ask me about it. And I'll do a whole separate lecture for you. I'm very serious. It's a very complicated area and extremely important because, back to that picture at the beginning, when it's an idea, it's just an idea. But when we give birth to the law, people are supposed to have jobs making that law really happen.
One point is, last week it's about the animal experiment.
Yes.
The EU generally, my knowledge, so far as I know, is not free from doing animal experiment. Difficult. For example, I'm doing some material classification studies. For the classification studies, we need 2 years animal studies.
Right.
It is very difficult to conduct in European countries.
That's a fact-specific question. Yeah. Okay, I would have to look at the treaty. I would have to see who signed it. I would have to see how many countries signed it, and how old is it, and how many people obey it even though they didn't sign it. It's a very complicated question. So you give me a research project, and I will do that for you. Back to the Council of Europe, and then you'll see in a moment why it matters. Usually I don't speak as much about it, but you gave me the time. And I think since we're talking about what does a regulation mean and does it matter, especially if they tell you about a different one, you've really inspired me because most people talk about EU regs and all these Council of Europe things are out there, and they could all be violated because nobody heard of the Council of Europe. All right, so they're famous or notorious, depending on who you are, for having ruled that genetically modified food is inappropriate and should not be marketed in Europe. And although it is marketed in Europe, they put in standards and things, and it took quite a while for the actual marketing to occur despite this rule. The important point here is that they can hear complaints against governments and that they're there for individual rights. And what that means for nanotechnology is because their underlying treaty says health is a human right, and therefore it's a human right in their countries that signed the treaty to join, and because they have a huge interest in consumer protection in other standards and other acts of the parliament, that they are ready to hear a complaint about nanotechnology. They are a ripe forum. And I could just imagine a European country that's not in the EU or an EU country that's violating something that Council of Europe thinks is important. And I could see all it takes is an individual to complain about their own government. It's really fascinating. So how do we do this? How do we put this package together and think about what do we do now in the time where all the governments agree that there's no good way to do it? We have guidelines and not law. Ilise keeps saying there's got to be a law anyway. We have agencies that don't have authority to make law, writing recommendations, and agencies with authority to write law not doing anything. How do we do this? How do we make some sense of this for day-to-day things now? Well, yeah, my book does tell you a lot of this stuff. I do talk about it in a very different structure than I do in an oral presentation. And I do have an entire chapter on emerging laws around nano. But the really baseline, easy one, is to start in the workplace, because the workplace is the microcosm. And because we know from asbestos that that's where the liability was discovered, even though ultimately the liability embraced so many people outside the workplace, that's why Congress and EU and India started caring about it, is because it mattered to other people in the greater environment, consumers and the greater environment. But the first cases were really discovered in the workplace. So the first thing is that sound occupational health programs that implement the best strategies are the grease for the machinery of powerful economic engines. They are not the fat you trim in a bad economy. They make it happen. And when I studied the asbestos cases with a view to what can we learn for nanotechnology, I learned, first of all, we needed baseline regulation. That the things that happened were really because nobody said, no, you can't do that. And the public was outraged not at the danger of asbestos, but the deception. At the fact that nobody said this stuff is dangerous. They sold it to line your house and line your canning process for the food you bought in a can, and nobody said it's bad for you. And the public, when they figured that out, was furious. And what happened next was really large multinational corporations filed for bankruptcy because of the number of liability cases filed against them. And they knew that even if they only lost a very few, it could wipe them out. And then you had congressional activity and international activity and everything that followed, because at the base there was no regulation. And because there was no regulation, there was no disclosure. And because there was no disclosure, you had an angry public in reaction. Okay, there were plenty more dangerous stuff, but it all came out of seeing what goes on in the workplace. So the first thing is the failure to do that, to think with forethought about what a smart general public would want to know about, really turned a very powerful multinational employer into a marginal employer. That period of time when they filed for bankruptcy and everybody was reviewing their bankruptcy documents and they were serious about really pulling out, in that period of time, they were not a wealthy employer, even though they were making $110 million a year in the 1970s, which was more than the GDP of some governments. Their liabilities were greater at that moment in time. So it wasn't just an add-on. It was essential to the life of the company to have a really good in-house safety and health program. That's the lesson you learn from asbestos. If you disclose something to the public properly, you don't keep secrets, because when the secret comes out, the cost is far greater. And the other is a good safety and health program is not an add-on. It's essential to the life of the company. It's the grease in the wheel of commerce. Why? First of all, you want to avoid liability. And in this day and age, it is not at all exaggerated to say that you don't have to have done anything wrong for somebody to bring you into court. And there is already a case on nanosilver in your beloved California, where in fact they delayed a rule for 3 years. It was a non-profit, non-governmental organization against the government itself, complaining about the way the rules were written poorly, that delayed the registration of products for 3 years. fascinating case. Love to talk about it if you want details. The point is, it wasn't even that they didn't prove a harm had happened. Their argument to the court was, we're so afraid that a harm might happen, we don't want to let this on the market. And the judge said, I have to go to sleep at night. I am not going to sign off on the opinion that says this is okay. And so even though there wasn't even proof of a potential harm, the court was persuaded to delay long enough to review the facts to see what was going on, hired its own experts to recalculate the agency calculations, came up with its own calculus of risk, and said to the agency, you know, we don't like what you did. And it took 3 years for that to get out of court. There was no harm that had occurred. So we're in an era where you really have to think very carefully about potential liability, even if you don't do anything wrong. And this is a very different ballgame, as they say in the United States. This is really different. The asbestos era, nobody expected anybody to have any complaint to any court anywhere. And really now, if you just have a group of people afraid of nanotechnology, they can walk into court whether or not they're founded in their beliefs, and a judge is going to say, whoa, I don't understand enough of this to just say it's okay. It's my job to protect the public, and I'm going to look carefully. And to California's credit, they did, but in fact, in a lot of ways, it was unfortunately a very silly case, in a lot of ways. They made a lot of mistakes because they didn't know, but the court was honest enough to say, we don't know, and we're going to hire experts. And that's so unusual. That says to me that what they learned from asbestos is if we don't ask enough questions today, we're going to have very sick people in the future, and we will be to blame. We're the court that signs our name on the opinion. So being afraid of liability as opposed to having liability is an extremely important variable and one to think about. And it doesn't mean you did anything wrong. And in the case in California, it wasn't even on the market yet. It's really, really impressive, okay? So one of the big things is to avoid liability, to offer a practical approach right there in the law. And this is very important. The law should be really, really clear about what good deeds look like and what has to be looked for. Can't provide answers. Provide a framework. If you follow these magic steps, then we believe you will have at least tried your best. And tried your best is what we call in the law due diligence. I'm a very strong believer in due diligence. It means that when you didn't know what's going on, you didn't say it's perfect, it's okay, everybody knows there's no zero risk and blah, blah. Everybody knows there's natural nanomaterials. No. Due diligence means you looked at the best reports, the most recent information. You told your workers the correct agency to go to if they have a problem. And you said, due diligence. Here's the reports. Here's what we looked at. Here's the steps we followed. Here's the people we contacted. Here's the infrastructure that does this regularly. And there's a framework for some internal consistency. So when somebody says, what makes you think this is okay to put on the market? You can say, well, actually, there's a lot we don't know. We don't know this. We don't know that. But these are the things we did look at. These are the things we do know. These are the things that can be proven. And these are the judgments we made, and these are the ways we back them up. So before you get deceived, the old-fashioned excuses, and indirectly this list does come from John. He's heard just about all of them. Who'll know if we do it or if we don't do it? And it's really expensive and complicated, and it's not really our business, and it's not a priority. And it's really easy to replace some of these people. And it's hard to prove the injury, which is, by the way, very true, and going to be more true with nano. And the problem with the fact that it's hard to prove injury means that a plaintiff's attorney, the attorney representing somebody who gets hurt, is going to sue people all along the line. In asbestos, they sued 15 defendants for every plaintiff, on average. There are studies that actually looked at this. And you can imagine with nanotechnology how many chains from the very first little lab of the nanoparticle all the way to the end product. When I said before Coca-Cola is going to be a consumer and a stakeholder, you know they're going to want to get out of that chain. And you know they're going to want to say, but we bought from so-and-so and they promised us this and that. And they're going to behave just like a plaintiff. They're going to have a similar need to you and I when we drink Coca-Cola, when we go to the legislature. They want to be out of that chain. So injury is hard to prove, but the reverse is true. If I didn't cause that injury, it's going to be harder and harder to prove. More and more people are going to get dragged in the net, and getting out of the net is going to be more and more expensive, even if you didn't have anything to do with it. And nobody needs to worry, of course, it's just gone. Tom has this video where he talks about how these laws are here to stay. The man has been in charge of NIOSH for 18 years. 2 different presidents have appointed him with the advice and consent of Congress. I believe that he means it when he says these laws are here to stay. So, this is also called best practices. Best practices are even less formal than guidelines. It's what a bunch of people believe are a good idea, but they haven't taken them to write a guideline. The guideline is a parallel universe. And we are in that parallel universe. Why? Because we don't have regulations yet. We do have emerging regulations. So I want to be very clear to you that I believe the era of saying we don't need nanoregs is gone. I believe that there are enough rules out there started by legitimate governments, that law part of the hierarchy, that if you're in a place where there isn't one, the first thing the judge is going to say is, well, but we know there's law. Why'd you follow the guidelines? We know there's law. Even if it's not your law, we know that you were taking from something to fill that void. And so if you're filling the void, why didn't you fill it with law instead of guidelines? So this is a very temporary moment, and in that sense, you have to be very careful. So effective management systems state right there in their mission, they're there to prevent, detect, report, and correct failures. And it's the last two that are really, really hard to get buy-in that really, in the end, save money in-house. To report a failure, rather than having people being afraid of being a troublemaker, and in some companies, reporting a failure means calling the government authority and saying, we have a problem. We saw that in Deepwater Horizon. They blackened the entire Gulf of Mexico. And they called EPA and said, we have a problem. And you're going to help us. And the Coast Guard came in to help. And NIOSH came in to watch the people doing the cleanup and survey them and test them and take their information, all with the approval of the company. Why? Because the company said, we're going to pretend, for better or for worse, we obeyed the law. We didn't do anything wrong in a specific way. The law may have been weak. We didn't do anything wrong. And you know what? They got fined a few $1 billion 5 years later. But in fact, before that, it was the report that saved their life. They called the agency and said, come help us. What an idea. It's hard to get buy-in for that idea, and yet it was enormously cost-effective. And to correct failures, be honest and give the power to the safety and health folks to come into a place and say, look, we know we had this and that accident, we know we had this and that problem, and we're going to try to do it differently now. Whether we have to restructure our training, whether we have to do something different in our equipment, we're going to do it differently now. And it's this reporting process in-house, which I'll show you a graph for, is actually the key. It means you're going to generate data that you don't want out in the world and in court, and that sometimes you're actually going to disclose that data all by yourself to prevent somebody else from trying to get it. And each program must decide for itself the area of emphasis that's going to foster compliance, because it's a question of corporate culture. We've actually reached a point in my beloved home country that we have anthropologists coming into corporations now. Did you know that? Seriously. Studying their culture and teaching them about their cultural values and what is it that their cultural values reflect. Because these are organizations with multi-dimensional problems. So each program has to choose for itself. So due diligence. First of all, due diligence is this fundamental concept of crafting and implementing a program. And it's bottomed on the idea that you want to prove you did what's right. You want to prove that given the state of the art, that I can stack up for you another 20 countries that said we don't know what to do, it's an unknown problem. Given the uncertainty of the times, given the really premature state of the science in nano compared to other areas, and the beginning but not clear understanding of nanotoxicity, and the fact that there aren't really regulations out there, that we do look for guidelines, given all this, we made some really good decisions. We were really thoughtful, and we looked over the literature, and we hired experts to advise us. We made some really good decisions. This is from Dr. Mark Hoover, who you're going to work with in the training program. He is the senior research scientist in NIOSH, and he and a team of experts, created guidelines. And this is a very handy chart. He's made it into a t-shirt. It's really cute. And the concept is exactly this. It captures the essence of what good risk management does. You anticipate the problem. You get a bunch of guys like us in the room, and you say, what do you think is really going to be the problem here? What is it we're not seeing, that we're missing, that could be, the one bullet that kills the king, despite all the guards? The one time that an airplane crashes into whatever, okay? The one time some idiot kid walks into a classroom with a gun. What are we missing that we don't anticipate properly the problems so that we can have the most comprehensive list of problems to anticipate, that we prioritize and strategize around? And then we recognize them. We look in the actual workplace with all these anticipated problems, and we try to see, where are they? Are they really here? Are these real fears? We evaluate. We take the measurements, and we take all the things, how we do their lung function. We look at their PPE, and is it effective? We measure the aerosols, and we look at whatever else, how many of them are smokers, and how many of them are overweight, and how many of them need time off to breastfeed. We do all that. And then we control. We come up with an in-house program designed specifically to deal with these problems that we have anticipated, recognized, and evaluated. And then we confirm. We make sure that our data is good. We make sure that our controls are working, that we have achieved whatever we have stated are the goals that we recognize as important. And then, when we're all done, we sit down, we relax, we breathe, and we start again. We do this on a cyclical basis. The periodicity of this, the amount of time for each phase, is known to everybody in the organization. So nobody is shocked when you come in and say, we're here to look for this, that, or the other thing. We're here to confirm that you've read the OSHA regs we sent you last week. And of course, the state of the art is very different now in Right to Know. I have a chapter about that too. The law is very, very different now about what's required. Again, from the asbestos experience. They found out that if you didn't tell people and they get sick, you're going to pay a very big price anyway. And so they decided, hey, it's a good idea to tell people what's going on and let them make some choices about whether they actually want to work in that place. But this chart this has become, this has been published in a lot of places. This has become a real sort of benchmark chart because it's easy and convenient, and it's a cycle is the main point here. It never stops. You're always going to come back and review and say, well, last year it looked like this, but what's the new problem today? So within that chart, of course, is the infamous hierarchy of controls. This is like so old that when they founded the ILO in 1919, it still existed, and every industrial hygienist knows how to do this, but I don't know how it spills over to other disciplines. What I do know is I once cited them in a U.S. Supreme Court brief, and then both NIOSH and WHO have discussed them in their guidelines. Eliminate or minimize risks at their source. We all have pretty much a consensus that eliminating nanotechnology is going to be unlikely. And even minimizing risks, it's unlikely that a nano-enabled substitute won't exist for what you're trying to replace. With asbestos, this was one of the really key problems because it never really emerged that there was something that would substitute with all of its key properties, even though there were many things for some of the key properties, and not all of those were cost effective. So eliminating asbestos is a perennial problem that lives with us, am I correct? We still have the problem. We can't totally really...
You mean the asbestos disaster?
Yes.
We have 2,000, or near 2,000 dying of every year.
Yes.
With past exposure results.
Yes, and it's long term.
Yeah.
But if you went back to the workplace and tried to eliminate all the use of asbestos in the society, you could eliminate some of it sometime in some contexts, but you really couldn't eliminate all of it all the time. It's very, asbestos, that's the other reason I talk about it for nanotechnology, is that the legal word is ubiquitous. It's ubiquitous. And even if you took away some of it, you would still have other times when you still need it, and you would have exposures that you can't control. That's how the general public got in. Because even though we found out first in the workplace, there were exposures in the general world that weren't from the workplace, and they all added together. So this is a real problem in nanotechnology that is quite analogous to asbestos. It's unrealistic to expect that you're going to completely eliminate the problem. So what do you do next? And under the hierarchy of controls, you reduce the risk through engineering controls and safeguards. And I think in nano, this is where due diligence is going to live. This is why I put it in red. I think that if you want to show that you're a prudent employer or user of nanotechnology in consumer products that get to end users who are not workers or part of that chain, but are just, putting titanium dioxide in face cream and to prevent the sun, or eating a donut whipped with titanium dioxide, then really this is where the defense is going to live. It's in showing that there were engineering controls and safeguards. And of course, providing procedures to reduce risks. This is where the right to know lives. This is where disclosure to workers and the general public lives. This is where saying we tried really hard to find out and we tested it ourselves, but we weren't able to really find, and therefore we concluded. And to have the courage to make that decision in public is going to be a huge saver of liability. It sounds so weird. It sounds perverse. But in fact, that's how it works. Because then you've shifted the burden. The legal term of art is shifting the burden. When you disclose, then it's now up to them to make a choice whether to do it or not. And that shifts the liability. When you hold all the information the way the asbestos companies did, and you don't disclose, you have removed the choice. And then you keep all the liability. They just didn't think they were going to get liability. But when they finally got liability, it was huge because they had kept all the data and they had kept all the information of potential harm. So people who might have very well continued in their same job or bought the same insulation argued successfully to a court, oh, I never would have done that. And all you have to do is convince a jury, I never would have done that. And then what's the answer to that? Well, of course you would have done it. That's not a good answer. Okay? If they told you, if you should have known, now you have a different discourse. So these two are very, very hard for a good corporate in-house program.
People, many people, not many, but some people are not known at all.
That's right.
The resident downstream of the wind of the factory. But,
that's right, and they didn't
totally
know at all.
Unknown.
That's right. And you see, once you prove they didn't know it all, then the person that didn't tell them has kept all the liability to themselves. Because maybe they would have sold their house and maybe they would have stayed. It's all conjecture. You can't prove any of it. What you can prove is that they had no such opportunity. You can say, oh, but the houses were so valuable they wouldn't have sold, they would have stayed. You can't prove it. But what you can say is they never could have gotten out with information because they didn't have the information. And in the asbestos cases, case after case, they were able to show that the information was never disclosed. That's why I say the lesson for nanotechnology is so complicated but clear. And the lesson for nanotechnology isn't that it was dangerous or that it was ubiquitous. The lesson was they never disclosed a problem. And since they never disclosed a problem, people went crazy. Legislators went bananas, people knocking at the doors, what are you doing about my dead sick husband? They had to answer. If they had disclosed something, it would have been a real problem. People would have had to make very difficult choices, but the nature of the liability would have changed. So these two are very counterintuitive to a corporation, but they actually save the life of the corporation. They are counterintuitive. You want to worry about intellectual property. You want to worry about competitors knowing what you're doing. You want to worry about the branding of a product to make it appealing so people want to buy it. You want to worry about good workers staying even though there's a risk once in a while. But in fact, if you're worried about liability, these two are where the liability lives. They're really the opposite of each other. One is to actually get in there and try and reduce it. And the other is when you can't reduce that risk, to be honest about it, to be candid, and say, look, we've got a big risk here. Not so much that you don't want this product to exist anymore, not so much that we're going to close down the factory, but just enough that there's some choices you have to make. And that's a very hard thing to say, but it's a very important thing to prevent liability under the way the laws have played out now. Of course, there's personal protective equipment, and this is a very problematic area because protective equipment under the hierarchy of controls has always had this worry that workers don't follow instructions and they don't wear them, and then other people say, no, they would wear them, but they don't fit. We know for a fact that, for example, women can't find properly fitting PPE. This is famous. I have been to dozens of safety and health conferences, including the World Congress on Safety and Health. And they have women who are tall and thin modeling men's harnesses and caps. And then if you want safety boots and coveralls with the right length and the hips in the right place, it doesn't exist. I've talked to the people selling them. And they said, well, we don't get many orders for women. So I said, well, that's because you don't have the product. If you want women to order it, you need the product. But what that means for the PPE. Okay, so this is due diligence, summarized. It's about communicating. It's about saying these things. Because why? Because at the end of the day, there probably is going to be some law somewhere of nanotechnology internationally. I think commerce actually needs it. I think commerce needs the consistency that if you ship from point 1 to point 3, at point 2 there's going to be a customs guy who either says we don't allow this in our country or we do. And if those laws aren't consistent in all 3 places, you will obey the law where you are and make a legally okay product, and you'll read the law from the place where it's going so that you're not sending an illegal product. And the customs guy in Brussels will say that we don't allow it here. So we need a nice, consistent body of law in order for commerce to flow. It's going to be a body of law with due diligence embedded in it, with a duty to disclose a whole bunch of stuff to prevent liability, which unfortunately will shift a lot of liability to consumers and end users. There's no question. But it will avoid the terrible things that happened in asbestos where people really had no choice. When the court said they had no choice, that was it. It was over. Then they had to pay. And that's what I think. I think that magic moment is going to happen in nano, possibly in another place. I think we have the blueprint in the global harmonization of chemical safety, which I would love to talk about another time. And basically, it's a revolution that can help health. And I hope you read my book. So you guys really got the hours out of me.
どんな質問でも、コメントでも。Any comments? No? 何でも質問でも。
Oh, Dave has a comment. Oh, sure. I'm sure Dave has a comment. I've just rewritten his biography.
You might have a comment.
Well, so one of the things I was wondering is like, if you make a law, and now you're a corporation and you follow the law, then if something bad happens, you're basically safe.
Yes. This is the lesson of asbestos. This is the lesson of cotton dust, which nobody ever asks me. When large corporations who had wetting down procedures and could actually capture the dust with, instead of letting it ventilate when they were creating fabrics, they had a system for wetting the area, and the dust kind of coagulated, and then it didn't go into the lungs because it wasn't hanging out. It made these big clumps that they turned into other products. And that was state of the art. At the time, it was the 1980s, and it put a few cotton producing textile places out of business because they couldn't afford the new stuff. But the ones that could afford it survived and complied with the law. And that was a Supreme Court case in the United States. Said it's okay if a few dirty marginal employers go out because this is the state-of-the-art technology, and the purpose here is to protect health. Okay, and it's what happened in Deepwater Horizon. It is absolutely, when you look at Exxon Valdez compared to Deepwater Horizon, these are two major oil spill cases in the 20th century. Well, no, Deepwater's 2007, right? So both cases, tankers and oil spills really hurting large bodies of international water. And the Valdez, there were new legislation came about, and the captain was sent to jail, and all these newspaper headlines. And in Deepwater Horizon, BP actually called EPA and said, we have a problem, and persuaded most of the courts and most of the judges most of the time that they had obeyed the law. And what can you do? You know, people don't send a bigger tax than their tax return requires. And it's true that they could have done other things that would have made the situation better. That's always true. But if you talk about a defense to liability, that's a different matter. The defense to liability was, we obeyed the law. You think the law didn't go far enough, write a better law, go ahead. And that was their defense, and it worked. They had really small fines compared to the damage. And they worked very diligently with the government authorities to encourage cleanup people to get all kinds of tests and exams. And the government kept the data. They didn't keep the data at all. They let the government store it. And it's sitting on disks in NIOSH and the Coast Guard. And you know what? They did something that, by all accounts, is horrible. But they were not treated as criminals. And the company goes on. And this is a very odd reality, that by disclosing and discussing in this candid way, the company actually protects itself. But to do that, you need clear regulations, you need consistent regulations, and you need to perform due diligence. You do have to disclose some bad things some of the time. Not a popular idea, but it works. It works. And just as a footnote to that, that's the difference between asbestos and nanotechnology. The difference is we're writing the regs now, before the use. And they wrote the regs after everybody got hurt. And yet the regs that were written after everybody got hurt, as we discussed privately, asbestos is in greater use today than before the catastrophic litigation. The actual tonnage in use is greater now. The regs help companies, and they don't understand that. I don't know why, but whatever reasons, This is a chance where they can actually participate in writing the law. This isn't there yet. So get on board, do it, be part of it. Have your say. It's really, from a democratic standpoint, very cool. Other questions? Did I go too fast? It's okay.
会社の方がそうそうデリゲーションの話で結構厳しく出てたので、日本語で
It's hard, but it saves the life of the company. Yes.
How do you expect future trend for regulation? Regulation become to control individual material or
So I think there's going to be control banding because everybody agrees that there are two problems. The first problem is that there are too many substances. And I mean, there's just, EPA regulates 80,000 materials. And they only regulate a tip of the iceberg because all you need is a slight change of the formula and it's not the thing that they're regulating. So control banding is widely agreed, even in ISO and OECD. And I think that's true. But the other thing is that actually looking at a material in isolation doesn't make sense. It doesn't really work. And one of the other lessons of asbestos is different, for better or for worse, if you're smoking and if you have other lifestyle issues. It's just true. And it may have been exaggerated and misused in the courts, I'll give you that. But the reality, like Hemingway said, the best fiction begins with one true sentence. The true sentence is that smoking makes a difference in asbestos. How you use it afterwards could be a fiction, but the fact is that if you look only at the asbestos, you don't get the whole story. So it's not, I think substance by substance is going to be out the window. And I think as we get closer to precision medicine in nanomedicine, that the one-size-fits-all regulations are going to make even less sense. That's where I believe the reproductive health questions are going to be very important. Because we're going to have the ability to do things for an individual on their health. So then, suddenly, 9 parts per million, that means if you have 12 parts per million in a basically clean place, you violated the law, even though nobody gets hurt. But if it's, even if it's a lower amount and somebody gets hurt, you haven't violated the law. This is going to lose all logic. And the only way around that is control banding. And I think we're going to see a lot of control banding. All we need is a framework. You just plug the right information in and get the right answer. Just need a framework. Anything else? Guys?
Thank you for your talk, and probably to all of them, it's sort of that the presentation is very, very first time.
Yes.
We scientists
Yes. I
don't
figured.
know well about what we are doing in science and what influences our science to the regulatory and law and legal matters. This is probably in Japan. This is starting point to understanding that the toxicologist contribution to the society. Do you think so?
Yes.
Everybody thinks so. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. One commercial. Shuji and I are working in the Nano Safe Fit for Nano program in the Archamps, France for 10 days. 6 credits, graduate credits from the University of Grenoble for students, if you know anybody. Basically, my role there as the Director of Law and Guidance is to bring these issues to the attention of researchers. But the goal of the entire program is what they call lab to market, that when you start your research, you think about what commercializable product you would have. And one of the things you have to worry about is not just the legal regime, but the other laws you have to obey. Silly things like registering your company, not discriminating, not hiring for too many hours for too low a wage, all that sort of stuff. making sure you have space for disabled people. But the point is that it's a multidisciplinary effort to take serious researchers and give an opportunity to commercialize, and the law is just one of those components. I welcome all the students present and the young lady, if possible, to join us in this 10-day adventure. It's funded by the European Union. Nano, Safer Nano is a federal project of the European Union to the extent they're federal. And it's the second year of a 3-year cycle, and the food is really good in France.
Which part of France?
It's outside Geneva.
I see.
It's actually a bargain. Oh, that's the best part. We're going to go to CERN for a day.
Oh.
You know what CERN is? The
セルンですか、日本語はセルン。ね、欧州、核、核物理学研究所を見せてくれるそうです。あ、そう。めったにない。例の大きなやつ。
Yes, the collider. Yes. We're going to take them on an official tour because the institute that does the teaching was founded through CERN. And we're a part of CERN. Actually, our webpage is there. It's complicated. But it's going to be really good, and it's a great way to see Geneva for cheap because it's the French side of the border, and he's a marvelous professor. It's going to be a really wonderful experience.
Switzerland side, the price is enormously expensive.
Yes, so we're in France. We're in a facility funded by the French government, and it is really true that the entire program costs less than 3-night stay in Geneva. It is really true.
私も持ってますので送ります。トクシコロジーの学会に送ってくださればいいと思います。これもっと中身の濃い話。あ、そうですね。してくれますので、セルンを普通に中に入れてくれないんで、今回それの中に入って見せてくれるって特典付きなんでね。それだけで。
Do they have my contact? Do I need to give them my card or something?
I'll send your copy to Professor and he will.
Okay, well, you can all have the slides. I welcome it. And I'd love follow-up from anybody. And I'm very serious that the students should think about coming to the program. It is really a bargain, but it's really worth it. It's a beautiful program. And we're in the mountains just outside Geneva, close enough that we're going to spend a day in Geneva. It's beautiful. So thank you for having me. And please feel free to ask me privately any questions you have.
Thank you so much. どうもありがとうございました。先生、今年の年だけど、来年のね、日本独占だったらね、いいですよ。